Welcome everybody to the Dole Center in Lawrence, Kansas. This is part of the spring discussion series that we call Giants of the Senate. My name is Bob Blaemire. My background is that I grew up in Indiana and used to work for a senator from Indiana by the name of Birch Bayh. I talked a lot about him in our previous session, and I will not do that now. Let me just say that we had a lot of connections in the Bayh career with Senator Dole in the passage of important legislation called the Bayh-Dole Act. And as a result, I ended up getting hooked up with the Dole Institute for a book event when I wrote Birch Bayh's biography, and then was invited to become a fellow here. So there are a lot of connections to Senator Dole because of that legislation, and it was a lot of fun doing this. And when it was suggested that we do a program called Giants of the Senate, I thought that made a lot of sense because we have a whole generation of people that know nothing about a Senate or have never experienced a Senate that actually works and that is a presence in our lives, unlike the Senate that we knew in our generation, the Senate that I worked in and that our guest Tom worked in. So I think it's important to expose the differences that exist, maybe discuss why they exist, but nonetheless, the connections to Senator Dole, there are many. Let me first talk about who our guests are going to be, and I want to thank the Newman's Own Foundation for their support of this program, as well as the coordination with the Baker Center in Tennessee, the Church Institute Center in Idaho, and the Paul Simon Policy Institute in Southern Illinois for cooperating with this program. We have, among the speakers, we're going to have, the next session, we'll have Peter Fenn, who will be representing Senator Frank Church of Idaho, who was the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman, and Peter and I lost our jobs on the same day in the 1980 election. And after that, we'll have Sheila Burke, who is a longtime high assistant with Senator Dole and knew him quite well, and she'll be here. Following that will be Luke Albee, who is a longtime senior staffer of Senator Patrick Leahy. And what I like about Patrick Leahy being represented here is that he represents the way the Senate was and the way the Senate is. He's still there now, has been there for 48 years. Then we're also going to have in the program Kansas's own Nancy Landon Castlebaum, not only Howard Baker's ex-wife, but the former senator from this state of Kansas. And finally, it'll be John Shaw, an author, biographies of Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and former Senator Richard Lugar. John runs the Paul Simon Policy Institute in Southern Illinois University. And so it's a program that, with Don Ritchie, who began, we have a historian of the Senate, an author, as our bookends, with both Democratic and Republican senators represented in between. So let me read a little bit about Howard Baker and a sense of why I considered Howard Baker a giant when we started discussing who to include in this program. I mean, Howard Baker was, first of all, the first Republican to be elected to the United States Senate from Tennessee. A lot of people forget the fact that for many decades, the Senate, the South, was solidly Democratic. There were no Republican senators. So Senator Baker started breaking that trend in 1966 when he won. His father had been a member of Congress as well. And one of the interesting things about Senator Baker's career is it wasn't what you think of as a typical conservative Republican's career. He voted for the Panama Canal treaties, the Martin Luther King holiday, was a Thurgood Marshal for the Supreme Court, voted for the Civil Rights Act. So these are important things to know about Howard Baker. He was also the son-in-law of the then Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen of Illinois. Dirksen's daughter Joy was the first Mrs. Baker. And I think there was some comment once where Senator Dirksen said something about his son-in-law who had never been elected to anything, and then he later got elected to the Senate. Senator Baker went on to become not only the minority leader in the Senate, but after the 1980 election, when I and others lost their jobs, the majority leader in the Senate. After that, and after his 3 terms when he left the Senate, he then ended up back in the White House as the chief of staff for Ronald Reagan. After the Iran-Contra controversy and all that, Baker basically was the savior that went into the White House for President Reagan. After that, George W. Bush appointed him ambassador to Japan. And as most of you know, during this period, he also got married to Kansas Senator Nancy Landon Castlebaum. So as a result of that, I was in touch with the Baker Center, and Bill Lacey, the former director here, had given me the name of Tom Griscom. And when I talked to the folks at the Baker Center about Tom Griscom, they connected me to Tom, who was interested in taking part in this program. Tom has over 40 years of communications experience. That is actually his expertise. It includes his being a journalist, as well as a corporate relations executive. He was press secretary for Senator Baker from 1978 to 1985, and later on went on to become the communications director in the Reagan White House when Senator Baker moved over there in 1987. He serves as the chair of the Tennessee Public Charter Commission. He was born in Chattanooga, married with 3 children, a graduate of University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, with a degree in English. Tom was the editor-publisher of the Chattanooga Times Free Press, vice president with Jody Powell of Powell Tate, a communications firm, and the executive vice president of external relations for Reynolds, RJR Nabisco, public relations. He is a consultant for strategic communications and crisis communication to this day, and an all-around good guy. So let me introduce you to Tom Griscom.
Thank you, Bob. And let me just say hello to those at the Baker Center in Knoxville, Tennessee, who are watching this today. I will try to do you well. But glad you're tuning in with us, and I'm glad to be here. I want you also to know it's a little chilly out here for a Southerner.
You noticed.
I noticed, but I think I will survive, and I get to go back home tomorrow, where it's a little bit warmer. But thank you for having me here, Bob. It's good to be here.
And let me just add also, those who online who may have questions, you can submit them by sending an email to dolequestions@ku.edu. And when we do the question and answer session, we'd be happy to entertain those. So Tom, let's talk about how you got there, why you got there, why you wanted to get there, and then maybe some of the highlights of your career in the Senate.
Well, the last thing I thought I would be doing is going to Washington, D.C. At the time that I'm growing up and looking at this is the 70s, and Washington seemed like this faraway country. I mean, and if you ever got there, you would never get back out. I covered Jimmy Carter's inauguration, and it was kind of fun, but again, it was challenging. So I get back, and I'm a reporter. I covered politics for the Chattanooga News Free Press, which included not only covering state politics and local, but also federal. And so every so often I would write a story about Senator Baker or Senator Brock at that point. And so one day I get this phone call from Senator Baker's assistant asking me to come to Huntsville. He wanted to talk to me. So I get in my car and I drive up there, and I go into his law office. The law office is the same building that both his grandfather and father had used, where they practiced law. And I go in, and he finishes a phone call, comes out, and asked me to come in. So I walk in there, and Senator Baker comes around his desk, and he stands nose to nose with me, and he's looking right at me. And I said, Senator, why did you want to talk to me? Because I thought about, okay, did I write some good story, or did I do this, that, or whatever? I couldn't figure it out. I told him it was my wife who really wanted me to ask the question. That's how courageous I was. But he said, well, young man, I can answer it for you real quick. And at that point, I was a young man still, Bob.
Yeah,
I'm gonna tell you.
1978.
That's right. He says,
and
he's standing right there looking at me, he says, because you're the first person I can see eye to eye on the issues. Senator Baker was 5'6½", I'm 5'6". And so it had nothing to do with any skill set I had. It had to do everything with my parents who brought a 5'6" child into the world. So I'm going to skip you ahead for a few years. Senator Baker is in Japan, and he comes back after President Reagan's death. And we're on the elevator in the Metropolitan Club in Washington, D.C., and I get this tap on my shoulder. He's behind me. He says, Tommy, you have grown. I said, no, sir, I'm still 5'6", and you're 5'6½". The best part of that story is Senator Baker is somebody I worked for forever. The best mentor I ever had. I've learned so much. Even today, there are things I know that he talked to me about, that he shared with me, that still apply. And that, for me, that relationship will never end.
Look, as someone who wrote a biography as former boss, and then all the, yeah, I understand what you're talking about there.
Absolutely, yes.
And if you really admire them and appreciate them. So, highlights of your career, what did you do? How did you enjoy being in the Senate? Because when Tom arrived, he was the minority leader.
That is correct. We came in as minority leader. Senator Baker was getting ready to run for president. He did. He had voted for the Panama Canal. And this is, it's important, I think, for people to recognize, because great senators looked across the aisle. They looked at issues in front of them and tried to figure out how would you get something done. And Panama Canal was a real issue that impacted the rest of his career. When he ran for re-election in 1978, shortly after the vote, his challenger on the Democratic side was was the state chair of the Democratic Party, and she was a national committee woman. And she was pretty liberal. She ran to the right of Senator Baker. She said, if I'd been there, I would have voted against the Panama Canal. And he ended up getting 56% of the vote. Now, from the media standpoint, they thought that was not good. He should have gotten at least 60, 62%. And I, at the time, when it was all over after Panama Canal vote, he said, Tommy, I've got some strange new friends and some mad old friends. But that's part of what he was all about, is looking at that. And as we looked into 1980, and when the election occurred, after President Reagan got elected and beat President Carter, and we came into power in the Senate with 52 senators. And I'm sorry, Bob, that you were one of them.
We were not one of them.
That's right. But what he had done in the previous 2 years, because the numbers started moving in the direction that Republicans were going to have an opportunity to take over the Senate. There were twice as many Democrats running in 1980 as Republicans. And so what he had done is he set up like a shadow majority, where he asked his Republican leaders, the ranking minority members, to think about, what would you do if you were in charge? How would you handle this issue? So that when it did happen, and if it happened even 2 years later in 1982, they would at least walk in having thought about, what would it mean if I was a chair? Rather than, oh my gosh, this thing got handed to us, what do we do now? And I think it was very helpful to have done that, to have spent those 2 years rethinking through. We had a lot of learning experience. Senator Byrd from West Virginia, who was the majority leader, was a master in parliamentary procedures. And he taught us a few lessons. How you move that Senate around. Senator Baker used to call it like moving a wet noodle, trying to get things done. But we got there. And but it was there were some fits and starts. Is probably the best way to say it.
And 2 years before Tom arrived in the Senate was 1976, and there's an interesting connection to the Dole history, in that Howard Baker was rumored to be a candidate for vice president with Gerald Ford, and in fact, I would say that many people consider him the front runner to be the vice president with Gerald Ford. But when it became clear from some late breaking articles that came out that Senator Baker's wife had an alcoholism problem, and so did Jerry Ford's wife. If you remember, Betty Ford had that issue. And the idea of having both of them having that issue in what was going to be a tough election didn't seem to make a lot of sense. And so Howard Baker fell off the list to be vice president, and Bob Dole became the nominee for vice president. You told me a story about you trying to break that story.
I'll pick it up from there. So I'm a political writer for the Chattanooga News Free Press, and we're staying on the same floor in what we call the No Name Hotel in Kansas City. It had changed its name 3 or 4 times, and so if we told a taxi driver we're going to the No Name Hotel, he knew exactly where to take us, and we got there. But I'm down the hall with a reporter for the United Press International. It doesn't exist anymore. And so the morning that we knew President Ford was going to announce his selection, we got a call from Senator Baker's press secretary, his then press secretary, saying, Senator wants to see you all. So we walked down the hallway into where he was staying. He said, I want to tell you all that I'm not going to be the selection. I've talked to President Ford, and he's going to choose Bob Dole. And so I come out of there, and I go back down, and I get on the phone. Cell phones didn't exist at this point, so I had to actually use the dial phone. And so I call back to my newsroom in Chattanooga. I've got this great scoop. And I say, so here's the story. Senator Baker's not going to be the vice president pick for President Ford. It's going to be Bob Dole, a senator from Kansas. And there's this silence on the end. I thought I'd lost the connection. But what came back was, who's Bob Dole? And, of course, I was trying to fumble through real quick. And I said, well, he's a senator from Kansas, and I think he's really big in agriculture. They did not run the story. So my great scoop never appeared because they didn't think it was true. And I said, but Senator Baker told me. He said, well, until we hear it from the president or his staff, we're not running. So I'm sitting here with this great scoop that never got in the newspaper. And not real happy that occurred, but then it became as we went forward, I got to know Senator Dole much more and much better, and really learned to come to respect him because he was really a very skillful legislator. He and Senator Baker became very good friends, and it was interesting to watch. And he was the master of the one-liner, and sometimes those one-liners made you smile, and sometimes after you smiled, you realized there was more to it.
And for those who remember or have studied Watergate and the whole period of Watergate, this was really when Howard Baker burst onto the national scene. Actually, Ted Kennedy had introduced legislation to create a special committee to investigate the break-in at the Watergate, which we all know how that all unfolded. And Senator Mansfield at the time, who was the majority leader, felt that there's no way he could have Ted Kennedy running this committee, because it was normal if you introduced the legislation and it got passed, you would be appointed the committee, but you can't have Ted Kennedy running an investigation of Richard Nixon, given all the Kennedy-Nixon history. And so he appointed Sam Ervin to be the chairman, a Southerner, a lawyer, a country lawyer, as he described himself. And then you can tell me about how Howard Baker ended up there and what he did.
So in 1972, when Senator Baker was running for re-election, in the materials he put out, there were pictures of the two of them together, Senator Baker and President Nixon. And President Nixon is saying these glowing things about Senator Baker. And he merited him. He really did. But only to find out just a short time later where he was named the vice chairman of the Watergate Committee. But when he was named, it was sort of viewed as not a star in his crown, but as a way to pay him back. Because he had run for leader, had lost. Hugh Scott, who was a Republican leader, decided, well, I'll show you. I'll make you the vice chairman of the Watergate Committee. And so Senator Baker is in that position. He goes in and, not necessarily expecting at all where it ended up. Senator Baker, for those who have followed him, not just as a politician, but other things he's interested in, he always had a camera. And it was his personal diary. He started taking pictures when he was a student at the Macaulay School in Chattanooga. And you never saw him without this small Leica camera in his pocket. I mean, when he was at leadership meetings at the White House, he'd pull it out and take these pictures before he'd take his seat next to President Reagan. But the one event that he did not take pictures was Watergate. And he said he didn't because he didn't think it would be dignified to have his camera out taking pictures. Later, he said, I should have done it because there was no dignity during Watergate. But the question that, and I find so many people today who, when they get into something, want to take the question, what did he know and when did he know it? And you want to say, wait, time out. Wait a minute. Don't just throw it out here willy-nilly. There was a real reason for that. And a real question being asked to try to find out, where did this go? It was only years later when I've got to go in the White House with Senator Baker that I'm in the office that H.R. Haldeman had, who was Richard Nixon's chief of staff. So I did look under the desk to see if there were any tape recorders or things like that. Figure maybe, but probably they were gone. But But Watergate, for Senator Baker, was that defining moment. And I think it showed to the country the character and the type of person he was. And it was tough. I mean, when he got to the point and realized what he was dealing with, but that also, I think, was a good moment too, Bob, for people to realize Senator Baker's going to follow the truth wherever it takes you. And if it takes you to an uncomfortable position, you weigh it, but if that's what you ought to do, I'll do it. And I think that was it was more of a defining moment than just the phrase that you've talked about.
It's fair to say it's really one of the first times, if not the first time, that so many Americans were able to observe the United States Senate in action and see true bipartisanship.
Absolutely.
I mean,
but there were some rough and tumble days too, as you recall, in watching some of those hearings. I mean, there was a lot of back and forth that went on. But yes, I think it was great for the country to see that type of democracy in action.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about it. It was really something. Okay, so Howard Baker benefits from the 1980 election by becoming majority leader, and of course, who succeeded him as majority leader, but Bob Dole. So there's another connection there. And so you stayed with Senator Baker through the 1984 election into 1985 when he decided to retire from the Senate. He was actually replaced in the Senate by Al Gore, who some of you may remember. And then the White House happens.
Yep.
So why don't you tell us how that happened and what your role was?
So I had decided that maybe, and had shared with our three children, particularly our oldest, that they were going to get their father back. I mean, I love working with Senator Baker. I want to make sure everybody understands that. But it's demanding. I mean, I travel with Senator Baker all the time. I was the staff person who was with him. There were other people on our staff who would say, boy, I would love to be on that plane with you all. And I said, take my place. I said, because what happens is when you do something that makes him mad, I'm the one that gets to sit there in silence or listen to it. I said, but that's okay, because he felt comfortable enough and we could you've been there, that we could talk about it. But I had told our oldest son that I was through with politics, done. I had run the 85-86 Senate Campaign Committee, where we lost those senators that we had won just 6 years earlier. And as I said, we lost them by a total of 20,000 votes. And what was said at the time is if we'd known we were going to win the Senate in 1980, we might have run better candidates. But that's history is history. But I'd gone to work with Jody Powell, who was President Carter's press secretary, and had just started in this new profession. He was still in the communication area, and I get a phone call from Senator Baker's secretary. And she said, we're sending a car for you. And I said, okay. Said, there's a whole bunch of media in Senator Baker's lobby at the law office. Okay. So the car shows up, I get there, and here's what had happened. There had been discussions about that Don Reagan, who was then the chief of staff for President Reagan, probably ought to go. And the First Lady was having a few conversations about it.
Yeah, he was notorious for being in an ongoing battle with Nancy Reagan, which is a big mistake.
It is. And being a Wall Street executive is not the best thing to challenge the First Lady of the United States, but he did. And we had talked earlier in the day about this happening, but we didn't think it was going to happen until the following Monday. And so this is Friday afternoon, and I'm getting this phone call, and there's all this media here. So I get this car, picks me up, we go down to his law office, and we have this news conference. We end over at the White House. What we found out later is that Mrs. Reagan thought that the president might change his mind over the weekend, so it got leaked.
By her.
Right, so it didn't. So it wouldn't get changed. And so we're in the White House here on this Friday afternoon, go into the evening. I don't have a chance to tell my wife what I'm doing. My mother, who lives in Chattanooga, calls my wife and says, some friends of mine said they saw Tommy on TV at the White House. Why didn't he call me? And she said, he hadn't even called me yet. And so this is Friday evening. Senator Baker is planning to fly back to Huntsville. And for him, Huntsville, Tennessee is the center of the universe. So when Nancy Cassbaum Baker is here, I hope you'll ask her, tell me about living in the center of the universe, because she ought to tell you some good stories. But he'd gone back to Huntsville. We stayed over. And Jim Kennedy and I went into the White House that Saturday morning. So when I first met Colin Powell, the White House staff, as I told Bob, Sheila Burke's husband was on the White House staff at that point, with Don Reagan. Don Reagan gave this piece of advice that Friday night. He said, you need to get you a flak jacket and put it on backwards. And so, okay, that's kind of interesting. He said, also, you're like in the, said, you've seen the circus? Yes. Said, you know the guy who pushes a little can with the sweeping broom? Said, yep. Said, that's you. And you're going to find that out. I mean, it was a really encouraging way to come into this and to think it through. But, and the last, I don't think I shared this with you, Bob. So we're in there, we're trying to get our hands around this, trying to figure out who all the players are, what they do. We learned about how people get in the White House, which is very different than how they get selected for Senate staff. And we also learned that President Reagan, who had not been seen for a while, Iran-Contra had happened, he'd been in the hospital, that there was going to be a televised speech to the country about Iran-Contra on the following Wednesday, and there was no draft. So he said, "Oh, welcome to the White House. It's just another day in the office." So that's how all that sort of started.
But if we remember the history of this, there was an open question on whether or not Reagan was any longer up to the job. As we all know now, he had Alzheimer's later, if not at the time. And so there wasn't there an open question about whether he was competent? What kind of position did that put Howard Baker in?
So we're sitting at Senator Baker's house on a Sunday evening before he is going to go into the White House. And we are going in the White House the following Monday. He's flown back from Tennessee. And one of the people who'd been on Senator Baker's staff, Jim Cannon, had talked to some of his people that he knew in Washington. Jim he'd worked for President Ford on the domestic policy staff, and he'd been at Time Magazine. And he said, well, I think there's questions about whether President Reagan is still up to the job. And keep in mind, President Reagan had been in the hospital, so he had not been seen for a while. And Iran-Contra had happened, and at that time, President Reagan was like your grandfather. When you sit in his lap and your grandfather makes you feel good. I mean, that's how Ronald Reagan made this country feel. And we hadn't seen him. But we heard about this Iran-Contra thing, about trading arms for hostages. And so the decision was made that night before we went to the White House the next day. We were going to have lunch with the president in the cabinet room. Senator Baker, A.B. Culverhouse, myself, and the president.
And this is before this speech is supposed to come.
That is correct. Yeah, we'll get back to that. But Senator Baker said, well, boys, we'll have this lunch, and we're going to come out there, and we're going to, we'll know whether President Reagan is still competent and can do this job. Because we also realized we were walking into a political situation we inherited. We knew nothing about it other than what we had read. And we were about to step in and try to take this on and prove to the country that President Reagan knew nothing about Iran-Contra. And I don't think any of the three of us wanted the last thing on our will and testament to be they went in and they got a president of the United States impeached for the first time. So we had this lunch. And we finished, and we went back down to Senator Baker's office in the West Wing, the Chief of Staff's office, and he looked at us and said, boys, I don't have any question in my mind that this president's up to the job. And we're not going to talk about this anymore. So I'm going to jump ahead and share something else. So you all may remember there were questions raised about whether President Trump was competent.
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah, and about invoking the 25th Amendment. So I'm at home, and I get a phone call from the Atlantic magazine. They had dug this back up, and we talked about it. And here's what I said to them. I said, if somebody feels like a president of the United States is not up to the job, they ought to say it publicly. Don't hide behind somebody else. There were these anonymous people talking about it. I think later we finally have now learned who it was. But this is a pretty serious charge. This is the president of this country a world leader. I don't care who it is. That's a serious charge. And you ought to be willing to say it. I said, that's my problem with it. And yes, we had this conversation. And we reached a decision. And it ended at that point. And so it was sort of ironic, Bob, that lo, those many years later, this very topic that we dealt with came back to life again, and we revisited it.
Well, go back further. I mean, part of the history of my own boss, Birch Bayh, was he was the author of the 25th Amendment, which deals with presidential succession and disability. And how that came about was because when President Kennedy was shot, there was an open question about suppose he had survived physically but wasn't able to carry on the duties. There was nothing in the Constitution that allowed the transfer of power to the vice president. And we had a vice president who had had a serious heart attack. Wow. There was nothing in the Constitution that dealt with a vacancy in the office of vice president, if there had been one. Or if he became president, there would be a vacancy in the office. So these were open questions to resolve about capability, can you serve, are you able, and there's now at least a process in place to deal with that.
I got to figure that Senator Bayh did this after President Reagan was shot, and Al Haig, Secretary of State, got up and declared, I'm in charge. And a lot of people said, nope, not sure we're going there.
Yeah, Birch said, no, he's not.
That's right.
I mean, he knew that one quite well. And talk about the speech, because you told me the note about the Reagan speech on Iran-Contra and what he had prepared.
Yeah, so we get to the end of Iran-Contra. And I tell you, it's the hardest thing I think I'll ever do in my life. I mean, it was intense. Every day we would start by anticipating what was going to be happening on the Hill. There were hearings going on. And when the day was over, we'd sit down and talk about what to anticipate for tomorrow. And there are things happening here, like you all may remember the stories about Oliver North and Fawn Hall, where I think that was the assistant, and they had taken their hard drives out and thought they had destroyed them. And these IBM people come in and they're reconstructing them. And so we said, oh my gosh, you have no idea. And they said, we can rebuild these. And they did. So you got these little pieces going on. I mean, every day you're sitting there waiting for that next piece to come out and figure out, is there something in here we don't know about? Because what I also said to Bob was that when Don Reagan was chief of staff, he said, we want to let Reagan be Reagan. That's what everybody talked about. And if you think about it, it's a great thing, except President Reagan's background in history was always having people around him. He delegated a lot, but the routine that we saw was the same routine, I'm told, that he followed when he was an actor in Hollywood, when he was governor in California. And he had people around him that really dealt with a lot. Senator Baker said Ronald Reagan had a central core of convictions, things he really cared about. But a lot of the details, other people did them, and he trusted them. So when all of a sudden you decide, we're just going to let the president, we're just going to, here's the ball, go run with it, that's not how he worked. So we get through where we can see the end of Iran-Contra coming. The hearing's about to end. And it's time for the president to speak to the country. And we went to Columbus, Ohio. At that point, Columbus, Ohio was viewed as the center of the country where you could get good readings on people's attitudes. And Dick Worthington, who was President Reagan's pollster, went with us, and we ran a series of focus groups. Today, you could not even think about doing this because we went into a room sort of like we're in. We handed out pieces of paper that were scripts, and we gave people blue and red pencils. And we read these live, said, now, we want you to underline in blue what's interesting to you, and in red what you think is just nonsense. And then we had a discussion. And out of that, we got sort of what the framework for what President Reagan really needed to say in this speech to the country. So he had gone to Camp David. And for those who think that President Reagan didn't write his own stuff, I will promise you he wrote his own stuff. He came back with a 3-page legal-sized document, handwritten. And there were strike-throughs where he'd gone and edited it. And he read it to us. And I'm sitting there with Senator Baker, Dick Worthington, and myself. And he finishes, and Senator Baker said, Mr. President, at some point that's a great speech to give, but not now. Because what he was attempting to do was to go back and retrace and convince people, I never traded arms for hostage. And it was kind of interesting. He always called the Ayatollah Khomeini the Khomeini, which we found kind of interesting. It was his, sort of his shorthand. And he did deliver the speech after he left the White House. He finally did. But Senator Baker turned to me and said, so Tommy, why don't you share with the president what we've learned? And I'm sitting here, and here's the president of the United States, and you're trying to tell him he's just delivered this speech as if he is standing up there and talking to the American people. And, well, okay. So we went through it. But the most important part, because President Reagan really did appreciate research. There's no doubt about it. He understood it. But we got to the point that what people really want to hear, because it's what they had seen over and over from him, they had lost his voice. They had lost that sense of that he's there and we can trust him. And what he needed to say was, here's what I thought I was doing. Here's what ended up happening. The buck stops with me. I'm responsible. Took the responsibility for what happened. And as soon as he did that, it was over. Mm-hmm. It was done. Mm-hmm. And I've advised any number of people that I've worked with since in the White House saying, I'm going to tell you what, I think I've got the best learning experience for why this works. The American people can be forgiving, provided you stand up and tell them and take responsibility. But all this came out of these focus groups in Columbus, Ohio. Think about today. If we went out and did this, I don't care where it is, you would see it within 5 seconds on some social media thing, trying to analyze we're doing this, that, or whatever. But that research was important. It was important for the president to see it, to understand what we'd done, the questions we'd asked, the response we got, and he trusted Dick Wirthlin, who'd been his poster forever. Mm-hmm. And so the last kicker here, as soon as it was apparent that President Reagan wasn't going to be impeached, there was a short-lived effort by some in the House to try to say, well, let's go after the political issue. Well, it was over. The country was ready to move. And I always felt that instead of trying to impeach President Reagan, you were not going to impeach him. You really weren't. If they had gone, the Democrats early on, for the political knockout, I don't think we could have done the things that we did in the last 2 years. I think politically, he would have been stalled, and it would have been a final 2 years of just running out the clock.
Let me direct you back to the subject that this mm-hmm. seminar is about. I mean, the giants of the Senate. Who would you describe in your 7 or 8 years in the Senate were the giants of the Senate when you were there?
Well, we're talking
besides your favorite and my favorite.
We're talking about one of them. Is the person I had the opportunity to work with. I think Senator Dole was clearly one. I think, and the fact that we're here, it's great to be in this facility that recognizes him and his achievements. I think Teddy Kennedy was one. I think Senator Kennedy was a voice that people listened to. He was a liberal voice, but I think he's very different than some of the liberal voices out there today that sometimes come across as whining. Mm-hmm.
Well, but he cared about getting things done.
That's correct.
That was also important.
That is correct. We also talked about Senator Muskie.
Right. Senator Humphrey.
Senator Humphrey was another one. And there were senators that some people might say, oh, why'd you put him there? Senator Helms from North Carolina, why he got viewed as being obstinate and leading a lot of these conservative causes. There was a lot that Senator Helms did that helped us get things through. You had to put up with a lot of stuff to get there, but Senator Helms and Senator Baker could work together and could get things done. And Senator Helms could bring along with him a number of senators that otherwise might not follow, because he was viewed with that conservative mantle and was viewed in the country with that mantle, so it helped to bring some things along. But I would start there to stop, because I know I'm going to forget somebody that really made a difference. But I say it again, I think sitting here where we are, that the work that Senator Baker and Senator Dole, and I put Senator Minchie because as the budget chairman, they really did some things in that first year of President Reagan's presidency that are still with us today.
Yeah, I think it's hard to define. First of all, what are our terms? What do they mean? Who is a giant? What constitutes a giant? And I think it's somebody that obviously is effective. It plays almost a larger than life role in the body. And not just whether they got publicity, but people talk a lot about show horses and workhorses, and I think that anybody who would be a giant of the Senate was a workhorse and maybe a little bit of a show horse. But there were people that were, as Don Ritchie said in our last session, all senators are equal, but some are more equal than others.
That's true.
And many, and people like Ted Kennedy stood out for effectiveness after he ran for president, not so much before he ran for president.
Correct.
So what happened? What has happened to the Senate? The Senate that you're familiar with and I'm familiar with, and the Senate that everyone here is now familiar with.
Well, if Senator Baker was sitting here today, and I wish he was, because I still miss him a lot, and I miss the advice and counsel, he would say to everybody in this room and those who are watching this, the country self-corrects. It takes time. And so where we are today, we'll find our way back to where we ought to be. Because that was part of it. Senator Baker was not just the eternal optimist, but there was a set of convictions he had and the respect he had for the presidency, for the institutions, and for the American people. So we find our way back. And I think that's, we will eventually get there, but there's some, a lot of people.
But it is different. What has happened? Yeah. What has made it different?
It's much more partisan right now than it was. It's really, I think senators on both sides of the aisle still do get together, but they do it where people can't see them. When Senator Baker there'd be a tough debate on the floor, and he might get toe-to-toe with a Democrat or with a Republican sometimes. But when it was over, it was over. They would then go back to his office, and they might have an adult beverage.
An adult beverage in the Senate? Beverage. Amazing.
Or they might go downstairs to the Senate restaurant and actually sit down and have a meal together and be seen together. And it was okay.
There used to be an era when senators, on late night sessions, they would have picnics outside the Russell Building out there near the Carillon, and families interacted. And it's a lot harder to be vicious with somebody when you've had dinner with them last night.
It is.
Those things have changed.
Well, although I think some senators still do it, they just don't want people to know it. Because it's not in vogue right now to do that, and that's a shame. Not.
Share with this audience, if you will. We're going to have to go to the question and answer session of this thing. Share, if you will, something that Senator Baker wrote a long time ago that you shared with me earlier today.
Yeah, I brought this because I thought it sort of summed it up. And this is several decades ago, but these are Howard Baker's words. We live in a political atmosphere now in which common civility seems about to join chivalry in extinction. An atmosphere in which we argue for the sake of argument and accuse for the sake of advantage. An environment in which the adversarial process has become not a means to an end, but an end in itself. In this atmosphere, the adversarial system leads not to accomplishment, not to policy, but to paralysis. I believe we have to start thinking about things a little differently in this country. While holding fast to our own principles, we must have a decent respect for differing points of view, what he called being an eloquent listener. We must understand that after the time of testing comes the time for uniting. We must recognize that it is the resolution of conflict rather than the perpetuation of conflict that makes the difference between successful self-governing and civil warfare.
And he wrote that, I believe, in 1980, right?
Decades ago.
Okay.
And you read it, that's why I brought it, Bob said, this ought to be the final word before you go to questions, because It's that you see this crystal ball sitting there, and he saw what was happening. But it's also important to know some of this was going on clearly while he was as a majority leader, and definitely while we were in the White House.
Okay, we need to open up the questions. Who might have a question here today?
Hi. So as like a press secretary or a director of communications, how much of that is just acting as a spokesperson for your boss, and how much of that is actually giving input, or at least your personal influence on things?
I think it depends on the individual you're working for. Senator Baker was a communication person. He loved it. He enjoyed it. He understood it. And the role I had, and I think part of the reason I traveled with him, and a lot of Senate offices, as Bob and I discussed, the press secretary didn't travel. It wasn't the traveling person, it was somebody else. But being able to sit down and talk through issues, help think through how we might say something. When the senator would open the Senate, I would go to the Ohio clock, which is right outside of the Senate chamber, and have a little gaggle with reporters. And he used to come by and he'd wave at me, and he'd say, well, now, Tommy, I didn't say that. And he'd walk on down to his office. But you earn that respect. But you also have to understand what your role is. There are other press secretaries on the Hill that did a great job being a scheduler. But they wanted to say they saw some of the things I did or others, and they didn't want to serve the same role. And it didn't work, because it's not how they're boss. I mean, I never lost sight of the fact of who I worked for. And that was Senator Baker. And he always reminded me, he said, I'm going to give you all this latitude because I trust you. But don't let me read something in the Washington Post I don't know about. And I've used that rule also with people, saying, make sure I know. It's the no surprise rule. And it's worked well. And you build that relationship. I mean, Senator Baker only knew me from my previous roles that I've shared with you all, but you come in and he assesses, okay, yeah, I think you can do this, you can do that. You get a little more rope given to you, to be able to do some things. And then it ends up, I said, I never thought I would have a job in the White House. And I almost turned it down because I shared earlier about talking to my oldest son and saying I was done. And I came within an eyelash after I did the transition. And Senator Baker looked at the chart and said, where are you? And I said, I'm not here. And he said, oh, yes, you are. He said, I'll walk you down and have the president tell you you're here. And I said, no, sir, you don't. Yeah, I'm here, Senator, I'm here because of you. And the biggest mistake I would have made if I had not stayed for those 2 years, because the experiences were well worth it, and just that extra time working with him.
See, I would add that from my experience, press secretaries were very much part of the advisor group. I mean, you wanted them involved in understanding not just what is being decided, but how it was being decided. And yes, the trust factor was huge, because you want to let the press secretary then leave the room and go out and talk to the press and not say anything they shouldn't say, or characterize anything that was false. But they were very much a part of our crew of people that were there for advice.
Let me add one other piece too. Words are important. As we know, people interpret words differently when they hear them. And so you're in a room with a lot of smart people, all these staff people who work legislative issues, things like this, and they think as a legislative person does. I think as a communicator. So I'm not changing what they're saying. I'm just trying to make it where the average person understands what they're saying and what it means to them, rather than, let me sort of tell you all this stuff, and at the end of the day, you're going to say, wow, you're really smart, rather than, let me give this to you in a couple of short phrases that really have a little impact to them and help you understand. That, to me, also, that's part of what Senator Baker understood and what he looked for.
Other questions?
think you've got one back there, Bob.
Yep.
Over the course of your careers, how have you seen the role of the press in politics evolve, and do you believe that it's evolved in a beneficial way or perhaps in a way that's more detrimental?
Can you say that again?
The role of the press, how's it evolved?
The role of
over
the press.
years?
Oh, that's what I thought you said. Well, I had this luxury when I was in these roles that there were not cell phones. The internet, Al Gore had not invented the internet yet.
And there was not a 24-hour news cycle.
And the major news organizations we met with every week, the daily newspapers like the Washington Post, New York Times. Then every couple of weeks we had what we called the regional papers that we'd meet with. We'd meet with the news magazines every week, Time, Newsweek, U.S. News. And then we'd see all the television. The three main, and CNN was just coming alive. They were in the White. We would talk with them, and so that's how news got out. I don't know what it would be like today. And by the way, it was, you were always on the job. So it's not like we were just we don't have all this other stuff. I mean, it was a 24-hour job. I have thought many times what it'd be like if every word that I said got picked up, interpreted by somebody, and is being interpreted not because it was, they wanted to share it. It was to try to take advantage of this, that, or whatever.
The gotcha moments.
Or some of the reporters who I worked with in the White House who became not talking heads, shouting heads. And that what really became important were clicks rather than something that you could read and pick up and digest. I think it's tough. I worry a lot about where the gatekeepers are. Everybody who is watching this, everybody in this room can be an editor of anything because you've got the tool in your hand. It's called a cell phone or an iPad or whatever. And you put it out, and some people may say they take it and they think it is the truth. Because if it wasn't, why would it be printed someplace? And I don't have the answer. But I watched today the people who are doing the kind of jobs that I've done. And I wish them well, but I'm concerned about it. Because I think trying to sort through and help give the American public what they want. I mean, one of the things I said, you ought to read something that's conservative, liberal, whatever. Have a whole host of sources, and then out of that, you'll find the truth somewhere. Rather than, I'm going to go right over here because this is what I want to hear. I hope that's part of Senator Baker when he says the country will self-right. I hope that's part of it because it's how we get information. It's how we start forming and shaping decisions and creating opinions. But I said it was difficult enough when somebody come in and say, your secretary came to work today at the White House and she was frowning, what's going on? Versus, I just heard such and such. I mean, it's just a different environment. But I hope we can sort of, I'm all for free speech, but I'm also for speech that is credible and accountable.
What amazes me is we have so many people in this society that will believe what they see on the internet and not what they see in the news from the news gatherers. It's fake news from people whose jobs are to gather the news. I mean, it is different. There's no question it's different. I think there are more reporters out there, and there are more people also that are involved in partisan reporting. I don't know how to quantify it or describe it well. I haven't thought about it that much, but it's clearly different.
So I've got this little plaque when I make speeches. I'll take up and see how people react to it, and then bring it with. I'll tell you what it says. It says, you hold it up and it says, everything that you read on the internet is not accurate, and the person who said it was Abraham Lincoln. There you go. It takes a couple of seconds to say, oh, the internet and Abraham Lincoln got it. But it's good to hold that up so people realize, okay, I guess that's right.
Well, he was one of the early Facebook subscribers.
That is correct, he was. But I think he's now gone to TikTok.
Yeah, well, we have other questions here. You know, one thing
We got one here.
you might want to also talk, if you can, about the bipartisan center, policy center.
While we're getting the question, Senators Baker, Dole, Daschle, and Mitchell created the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C., and it's still operating today. So there is still hope. There really is.
Hi. So I was wondering if you could just talk more about when you were working for Senator Baker while he was a senator, and especially as the Senate Majority Leader. How much did he consult, I guess, with his advisors and the people who worked with him on policy decisions and his day-to-day decisions within the Senate? And how did those decisions have to take into account reactions from his constituents in Tennessee and other things like that?
Senator Baker never lost sight of the fact of the people who elected him. But he also would say that once the election's over, I represent everybody in Tennessee. Panama Canal, there'd be a whole bunch of people saying, no, he didn't represent me, but he said, you elected me to serve what I feel is in the best interest of people in Tennessee, and he felt that that decision on the Panama Canal was in the best interest. And it cost him politically, we know that. Senator Baker had a lot of people he would listen to and talk to. But he did a lot of that himself. You would find him he'd go to the Senate gym quite often. The Senate gym was a place where a lot of senators could get away from us, the staff, and just talk. And you could have a conversation with anybody, Republican, Democrat, didn't matter, but it was a great place to have those discussions. Or if there was a heated discussion happening, an argument, let's say on the floor of the Senate, he might just sort of walk off, and somebody say, well, Howard, why are you leaving? He said, I don't have a dog in this fight. He'd just go down to his office. He'd just say, I'm just going to mosey down here at the hall for a little bit. And let it sort of work out. And in doing that, though, he let all the steam come out. And finally, when he came back, all the words were done. And you could say, okay, now let's figure out how do we get to where we want to go. But he would ask good questions, listen to people, but then at the end of it, he took his own counsel. Yeah, probably the best example I share with Bob is when he ran for leader in the Senate, he lost a couple of times. And he'd ask others to help him do the vote counts. And they were doing it by phone. Or they might run, somebody, but it wasn't Senator Baker himself. So when he ran for leader,
when he successfully
ran for leader, not majority leader, minority leader, he said, we're going to do this a little bit different. I'm going to go talk to every senator myself and look at them in the eyes. And I will know whether they're telling the truth or not. And he won.
Any questions?
These are good.
Let me before you finish, Bart, go ahead.
I have a question. As Senate Majority Leader, how did Senator Baker balance you referenced Jesse Helms. How did he balance sort of the conservative and more moderate establishment wings of the party?
He had Jesse Helms on the right and Lowell Weicker on the left. And there was
Well, in some cases, probably the way to give you the best couple of examples to get to the question you asked. When we first came in as the majority party in the Senate, we hadn't been in this position since 1954. And so we had to govern. And Senator Byrd from West Virginia, Democrat leader, he knew, as I said earlier, he knew the rules. He knew how to use them. And so we had to vote for a debt limit extension. And some of the people that Bob referenced who ended up beating his boss, they campaigned against the debt limit. Think about it today. But it was a big deal. The tax and spend Democrats and Republicans were the fiscal conservatives over here. And the debt limit was that thing you held up as an example. And so Senator Byrd came in and said, Howard, I'm going to give you X number of votes, but I'm not going to give you enough to pass it. Because he was going to make sure these newly elected Republicans, and there were a bunch of them.
And newly elected Republican president.
Yes, and a new Republican president, that's right, who also had sort of talked about this. You're going to put your votes on the board. And so we were having these discussions going back and forth. And we weren't making a lot of headway. And the president made a call a couple of times to some of these senators. And finally, Senator Baker brought all the freshmen into his conference room in his office in the Capitol. And he had Senator Thurmond in there. Strom Thurmond had never voted for a debt limit extension in his career. And so he turns to Senator Thurmond and says, Strom, let me just call on you. Why don't you share with these senators your point of view? And he said, yeah, you're right. I've never voted for one, but I've never had Ronald Reagan as the president, and we're not going to, the first real significant vote, have him lose. And we passed it. But then we'll tell you two others that are important. The next significant vote was about sending AWACS aircraft. These are aircrafts that have the little radar thing on top so they can sort of take pictures and stuff. We're going to sell them to the Saudis. And the Israelis were not really pleased with this. I mean, at one point they said they're going to spy in our bedrooms, okay? And this was a bipartisan issue. And it took putting together Democrats and Republicans, and we won by one vote. And then the last one is, as I said earlier, the same procedure that was used, if I remember right, to get some of the things that President Biden has done on the economic standpoint through was a new process that sort of got around the filibuster, and it was called reconciliation. You can forget the word now, but it still exists. But it got created in 1981 to pass the Reagan budget and tax cuts. And there were 43 votes, 52, there were 43 votes with 52 Republicans standing fast 43 times. And they were voting against things that, oh my gosh, it just, but that's how it works. But they held together. And they held together because, and not because it was just being in lockstep, but because this was a president coming in. The country at that point was coming out of double-digit inflation, unemployment,
interest rates.
And it was to say, we're going to get this done, and we're going to get the now. I think you all know we had a little bit of a dip, but then things sort of pulled back out after that. But that's how you put these things together. That's how you get things done. But you also have to, the reason I want to talk about AWACS, but it also takes sometimes Republicans and Democrats working together and finding that common answer.
You know, you and I are talking about human beings. And that's, sometimes we forget the fact that they're people like, they put on their pants one leg at a time like the rest of us do. What's your favorite story about Howard Baker, the human being? Well, this one's very personal. My wife and I, we have 3 kids, 3 children. And Senator Baker was like a second father to them. And that's why the relationship to me is very, very special. Our oldest son, as I mentioned earlier, was a photographer, so Senator Baker gave him tips. And I told Bob earlier that if Senator Baker could see what he's doing now, he'd really be proud of him and probably take credit for it, and he ought to get some. But we also have twins, a boy and a girl, and they were preemies. And they were born at the Columbia Hospital for Women, which is now an apartment complex in Washington, D.C. And everybody expects that babies are just supposed to be pink-cheeked and bouncy and all this, and you have them and they come home within a couple of days and all this. Well, one of our twins stayed in the hospital for a month. The other one stayed for 2 months. And so Senator Baker knew that this was on my mind and my wife's mind. And so he would ask
frequently how things were going. And we were going down every day. The bonding episode, I'll tell y'all, in a neonatal world is real, because you're looking at people in the same situation you're in, and you're hoping when you come back the next morning that your children are still alive. And so I shared that with Senator Baker. And within a day or so after that, there's a person out there scrubbing up, putting on a gown, got a camera. These nurses there are saying, "Oh my gosh, it's Howard Baker, Senator Baker." And he came in, and we've still got these pictures now. We've shown them to our twins, who are now 36. The first pictures ever taken of them were by Howard Baker, and he took them home and developed them and gave them to me the next day. And he would ask how they were doing. And that relationship, I mean, when Senator Baker passed away, our three children, well, one of them was in Korea, still teaching, and she wasn't able to come. But they were invited to be at the funeral. That's part of what meant so much to us.
And that explains the commitment in many ways.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I have a similar story in my life. My oldest son had open heart surgery when he was 4 years old. I would call it the worst day of my life. And the only person that showed up at the hospital outside our family was Birch Pye. And you know, it meant a lot.
Yeah.
It's but again, it's one of the things that it strengthens that bond you have for them. So you know, I just, those things are valuable. They are obviously not as important as maybe some of the more legislative things and the things they did that affect history. But it still is the thing that explains this commitment that both we've had to continue working for our bosses after they are gone.
They're very genuine. The things that we sometimes forget, and President Reagan the same way, I said, the Howard Baker you saw publicly is the same Howard Baker I saw privately. Same thing about President Reagan. There's this notion that these people are like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And
Some are.
And some are, that's right, some are. Some are difficult. But then there's some that really, you do anything for them because they do anything for you. And they recognize the the sacrifice. Senator Baker there was a series of lectures by leaders, and he did one, and he called it the Baker's Dozen. There were 13, as you would expect in a Baker's Dozen. But one of them was about staff. He said, staff is important. You need good staff. You need to listen to your staff. They can do this and that. But said, and the last line was, but the staff needs to also understand who they work for. And if you remembered that, it was a great relationship because we all worked for him. At the end of the day, he's the one that had to get the votes. He's the one that had to get the votes in Tennessee. He's the one that had to get enough votes to get something passed in the Senate. And if we remember that, it wasn't about us. It was working with him and having that opportunity to be, to help him and to be there for him and to help him get to where he needed to be. If we could do some things where it took some of the pressure off, that's what it was all about. I think if Senator Dole was here, these are pressure cooker jobs. And some people said Senator Baker had the patience of Job, that he could just sort of figure out how to get things done. And at the end of the day, he would herd those cats, and they would come out with some kind of a decision that moved the country ahead.
Well, Tom, it's been an honor to have you here. I thank you for joining us. I appreciate everyone here for joining us and those at home. We'll see you next time.